So who was it? Spiro Agnew that used the term nattering nabobs of negativism?
I believe that was Spiro Agnew, which is
Uh,
awesome, by the way. That
all right.
administration didn't know how to turn a phrase.
Yep. Yep. Well, we're a small group, but that's fine because this will hopefully be discussion laden and so what I wanted to talk about was the lab version 2.0. And this is driven by a couple of things. One is the lab's been now around for 4 years. We've got a body of work. We were organized and oriented around a certain framing, and it's an opportune time to sort of look at that and see whether or not we want to adjust. The other thing is, since the lab is not a RAND cost center, and we are funded philanthropically, looking at ways to frame the work that may be attractive to funders is also another consideration. And then another piece is just after working around the space for a while, just sort of figuring out where we want to go. So this is the way that the version 1.0 of the lab was. It was oriented around 4 broad technology areas: Internet of Things, AI, machine learning, AR, VR, and gaming. We had these cross-cutting topics of narrative, privacy, security, and ethics. The tagline for the lab of applications and implications, I don't think changes, because that we still try and look at that. And I think that kind of is a policy thing as well, to really understand implications of things that are going on. And so the way that the lab was originally organized was we tried to have a what we called a lablet. These were 4 areas were called lablets. They had a lablet lead who was a RAND researcher who the lab covered a small chunk of their time for them to shepherd efforts and work with students and work with the lab and whatnot. We never did end up, the IoT piece was filled by Aaron Lucas, who was our lab tech for a year and a half. Aaron went on, he's now working for a robotics startup, which is a really good fit because he was a robotics guy. And then, but we did have Tim Marler has been wrangling the AR, VR, John Welburn on the gaming side, and then Gavin was doing AI machine learning, and then we also had Ashunde, who was associate director of the lab, who was also in the AI ML camp. Ashunde has moved on to LinkedIn. Gavin recently left for a quantum computing startup, so that also was an opportunity to rethink the way that things are organized. And I think for me, the biggest criticism of this, and if folks have comments, feel free to just chime in. The focus on the technology, I think was actually the right thing for the early days of the lab, because we wanted to emphasize, when you're standing up a lab within a policy shop, not clear that lab and policy shop go together. And then when you bring the emerging tech piece in, I think it was really valuable to focus down on the emerging tech, and that the lab is about this. The lab is also about us trying to look at applications and implications for policy and society. But still, that framing for the lab was really focused on the technology. And so for version 2.0, what we're looking to do is actually move towards grand challenge questions. And we've identified 3, and then they have some sub areas. This doesn't mean that the lab won't do work that is outside of these grand challenge questions or areas. It's just that these are things that we think are important. There are big policy problems that are associated with this, and we think that emerging technology is going to be a big part of both the problem and the solutions. And then we've tweaked our cross-cutting to mirror some of the cross-cutting efforts within the school, and then also the sustainability piece is really important. I wrote a short blog piece on this at the beginning of 2022, because to me, in some ways, the equity and the ethics issues are a sustainability question. If you don't have equitable situations, that is inherently unsustainable. So that the sustainability, equity, ethics, and narrative are at the heart of everything we do. And then these three sort of broad areas for the grand challenges. And then we've identified three sort of initial experiments or areas that we want to focus on. I'll talk about the biorisk first, because this is in some ways the least, we've got the least amount of sort of historical work on this, although the fire data, the fire sprint from last summer, I think fits under biorisk. Part of this falls out of conversations we've been having with Lawrence Livermore Lab about collaboration, and they've got a fair amount of work going on broadly around biorisk. So we've done some joint talks over the last couple of months. But the three subtopics under here, and again, some of these are notional, some of these are further along. Two of these are mostly notional. So the first is the next pandemic. This is just, we're already seeing this with monkeypox right now. The reality is that COVID was probably long overdue and is likely just a harbinger of a new normal when it comes to biological risks for humans. So figuring out the next pandemic, and we've got a biorisk sort of thing. I can get to that at the end that we've started to work through with Lawrence Livermore. And then climate instability and adaptation. I think the firework last summer touched on this. This summer, we want to do work around water. I think clearly that falls into this climate instability and adaptation, and God knows that California is knee-deep in the goo on this. And then the third is, and I see Sonar just joined, so Sonar, I just mentioned the climate instability adaptation, and that water work this summer falls under this grand challenge area of biorisk. And then the third is one that we aren't very far along on, other than doing a lot of thinking about this, but this is part CRISPR, part bionics and other physical augmentation. But I think we see a lot of issues with both genetic and bioengineered modifications of humans coming down the pike, and we probably need to get a handle on this before it goes too far down the rabbit hole. The next grand challenge area or question is, since we do so much government work, I have to make acronyms for things. So the last one was BRUISE. I didn't call that one out. Biorisk Understanding, Intervention, and Sustainability Explorations. Grand Challenge 2 is Policy in Hybrid, Immersive, and Virtual Environments. And this, we've actually got a pretty good start on some of this work. So we've got a metaverse world build that is ongoing. Some folks on this meeting have participated in some of those. We're going to keep working that. Tim Marler is running herd on that effort. This equitable interfaces, ethical experiences design field. Ben, I see, is here today. Ben is taking this ball and running it along with Michelle Priest. Basically, when we want to create a new field, because we think UI UX is what helped take computing from a niche capability to being incredibly pervasive. We think that thinking about equity and ethical issues as you design these future interfaces and future interactions actually needs to be its own field because it is so challenging. And then the third one, I this is notional, but it is around and we were talking about this in Tech and Society class yesterday. The models for content creation have drastically changed. It used to be that a small number of people produced the content that people consumed, and a smaller number of people were the gatekeepers of that content that was consumed by people. And that model with social media and YouTube and TikTok has drastically flipped. And there's a lot to unpack there that has to do with intellectual property laws, that has to do with a short attention span theater, has to do with deep fakes. There's a lot going on in that world that we think should be mined. And then the third grand challenge question is around disinformation. And this is not the same as truth decay. It will likely leverage a chunk of the truth decay work. But this is going at a couple of very specific approaches to try and wrap our heads around disinformation. So it's what's for dinner. The first is, this one is notional. It's a play on seminal Rand work focused on the existential threat of nuclear weapons. So as the story goes, the short story is nuclear weapons become an existential threat to society. Rand comes up with the concept of mutually assured destruction, and the world goes happily along, and we knock on wood haven't had a nuclear military event for a very long time. So the inspiration for this was, okay, given the current state of social media and other media and the amount of disinformation, is there an equivalent concept for social media? And I wanted to keep the same acronym of mutually assured, so MAD. And I don't even know what this looks like yet, but I think there's something here, and I would love to be either proven right or proven wrong. But is mutually assured deception something that actually will become a thing between nation states and non-nation actors when it comes to disinformation? The next is something that we're actually going to do a proposal. We've been asked to do a proposal by the NSRD folks for a Schmidt philanthropic call. And this is the idea of narrative red teaming. So I did a short blog piece on this. I don't know if folks saw the story about DHS had created a governance, something called the DHS Disinformations Governance Board, and they it turns out that people freaked out when they heard that, and disinformation started about the Disinformation Governance Board before it even got its legs under it. And it got to a point where the head of it, Nina Jankowicz, actually resigned. And there were some quotes that I pulled out saying, and this was from an NPR article on it, and they asked, why was the board's purpose so poorly communicated? And she said, I think DHS had other priorities at the time the rollout was happening. They didn't anticipate this fierce backlash, and they weren't able to mount a transparent, open, rapid response when these criticisms came down the pike. And so if that isn't a call for narrative red teaming, I don't know what is. And so the concept of narrative red teaming is, if you are about to announce something like like the Disinformation Governance Board, or you're releasing a data set or a report that will probably be weaponized, what you need to do is actually assemble a crack team of people who understand the subject matter and understand narrative, and basically red team it and figure out what the toxic narratives and weaponized narratives are going to be before you release it. And then you can design remediation or countermeasures so that when you release this, when the first hints of disinformation around it start to pop up and go viral, you actually are prepared to then counter that. So it's like so it's narratives and anti-narratives and anti-narratives, but I think narrative red teaming is a thing, and companies have done this for a while. It's usually when a company does something really bad, they bring in the spinners to the basically PR firms that are very good at doing disaster management when a company has gone off the rails. So it's not like this isn't without precedent, but I don't think that this has really been done around sort of this, government agencies and policy and the work that Rand ends up releasing that can be weaponized. And then the third subtopic is another notional one, which is counter fallacy prototyping. And I don't quite know exactly what this is, but there are a number of logical fallacies that end up getting used in disinformation. So is there a new class of fallacies or a new set of counter fallacies that can be created and experimented with and then used to try and remediate disinformation? So these are big problems. There's lots of little pieces that can be sort of popped out of this. And yes, I was evidently looking at paint manufacturer color wheels for the inspiration for this. But this is this is the thinking. And again, this is not to the exclusion of other work, but I think that these buckets are pretty darn broad, and a lot of the stuff that, if I look back on work that's been done in the lab, a lot of them actually can fall into some of these areas. So that's all I've got on this. Comments, questions?
Hey, Todd, it's Jim. Hey, everyone.
Yep.
I think this is looking great. My immediate question is sort of logistical or planning kind of question. It looks like part of the impetus for change is adapting to circumstances around, staffing in some respects. Do you have any idea of who might potentially lead up these three different thrusts, or?
Yeah, so I don't know that we'll end up having a single lead for each of the grand challenge questions. I think actually what I'm thinking is that for the three main grand challenge questions, there's kind of a team, and that team can be fluid because there likely would be a lead for the sub efforts. So for instance, Tim Marler is wrangling the metaverse world build. Ben is wrangling the EIEX. So I probably see that there's more leads in those areas. And then for each of the overarching grand challenge questions, it's a team that we've put together. And my hope is that actually students will end up leading or co-leading much of this work.
Very cool. Thank you.
I think the bio risk category is really interesting. When I was doing my PhD at Maryland and a postdoc after that at Maryland, we developed a big bio what, a biosecurity prototype system for looking at hazardous biological research and kind of doing IRB kind of work, but in a biosecurity context, and also in a context that where you could have things reviewed at levels above the university. So that potentially doing something really dangerous might need international review and kind of global scientific consensus that this was a good idea and was being done properly. But yeah, I think I like the idea of the bio risk being really a much broader bucket than that, including climate. I mean, climate change is an earth science problem, sort of, but ultimately the reason we care is that biological systems don't work well when it gets too hot. And then, and of course, the pandemic and the so the pandemic might want to be thought of in a broader biosecurity context. Not every biological hazard is necessarily exactly a pandemic, although I guess it sort of is, and you sort of, people understand how serious pandemics are at this point, which they didn't used to at all.
Yeah,
so I'm kind of babbling here, but
yeah, you can kind of put pandemic in air quotes because I consider CBRN somewhat of a pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is broader than just focusing on like the next viral or bacterial vector that gets loose. I wanted to pull up. We did a conclave a couple months ago that was joint with Lawrence Livermore, where we did speed dating. Basically, a chunk of folks from Rand and a chunk of folks from Lawrence Livermore were asked what bio risk problem keeps you up at night, and so we did that sort of speed, and they only had 60 seconds to answer. That was the speed part of it, and out of that discussion, I generated this framework because what the problems that people were talking about, there was some clustering. And it really was this idea that there are kind of three big problems that are associated with this. One is the amount of data, genomic data, the amount of bio implantables and wearable biomarker data. There's just an insane amount of biological data that is now being captured, and then also climate data and everything else. And then three sort of sub areas. You see this risk, everything's threes, right? Because three is a magic narrative number for humans, it turns out. But there are, again, these issues of privacy, security, and weaponization around data. And then we talked, I think what you were sort of getting to with what you were looking at Maryland, this idea of regulation, and how do you start to do regulation that scales. And when I'm saying scale, it's like, okay, a neighborhood versus a city versus a state versus a country versus globally. And what happens when you have asymmetric regulation, which we have right now, right? That was evidenced by the Chinese doctor that did the CRISPR experiments on babies, right? That's even though China punished him for it, it was clear that their regulation around that emerging technology was very different than the US's regulation. And then also a lot of these biological capabilities are coming online so fast, and regulation is not necessarily thought of as an agile process, but it probably needs to be. And then, getting to the pandemic, and I think some of the other biological risks was this idea of we are not prepared. And part of the reason is we don't really fully understand the systems that are at risk. And then we haven't put the resources in place. So I'm not sure what we're going to do with this framework. I'd love to find somebody who wants to, give us buckets of money to really start to work out these different circles, because I think if if you're thinking about how the planet is going to be, how human life is going to be sustainable, we need to wrap our head around this framework and understand how to operationalize it. Sonar, got your hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
One thing tangential to this that might have even come up earlier that seems to be coming up quite a lot in conversations I'm having is kind of this dual issue surrounding institutional decay and digital decay. A lot of the assumptions that went into digitizing systems, getting all of our data online, a lot of that I'm seeing seems to be breaking down. I mean, we're watching as giant data collection efforts are suddenly losing funding and losing servers, and there's an aspect to that in policy conversations that seems to be very integral to each of these that I just wanted to throw out there as something that could help build branches between each of these circles.
Yeah, I don't have a good response to that other than, yeah, I think that's a huge problem, because this was another case where we just sort of went forward, right? Everybody said, oh, we've got to digitize everything. I'll tell a war story. Back in the early 2000s at USC, there was a push to move most of the business services online. And of course, a lot of the back end, particularly the financial systems, were actually, a lot of the programs were written in COBOL and running on mainframes. And as they moved pieces of the system online, the solution that they engineered was, because that COBOL-based system couldn't do real-time stuff and interface with any of the modern systems. So every night or every morning at 2 a.m., they would basically shut down everything, and they would run a report, and then they would ingest that into the other systems. So, and I think that was not an uncommon procedure, as there was sort of this hybrid approach of modern digitized real-time network systems with legacy standalone systems. But I think a lot of that work was done, and then eventually the legacy systems were moved off into current system or new systems. But in a lot of ways, they basically just replicated the legacy capabilities and didn't think about data structures and didn't think about sort of future ways that they were going to need to do this. So I think there's a lot of ticking time bombs, because unless I misunderstood part of what you're talking about, is that part of that and the digital detritus, and then also this issue of things being archived in formats that are no longer accessible or usable. So why are we keeping them?
That's absolutely it. I think one other piece here is literally that as funding dynamics for nonprofit efforts that do play a powerful role in governance. I'm thinking mainly here of environmental data sets, but also things even like the Internet Archive. They're really critical roles that these databases serve. However, the maintenance of them and their continued survival, literally just the storage and keeping those servers running, is one of these things that we are getting very distracted from. And that, on some level, is an attack vector, but it's also a huge vulnerability in trying to build new systems on top of it.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm just looking at the diagram and thinking, yeah, I'm not sure. I think that it fits under the, to me, it fits under the virtuality, because it is the digitization of all of this data, and then where's it going to live? Yeah, that I think that's a problem that we're going to start to see more and more of as standards, as network and storage standards start to change. It's funny, USB is still backward compatible. JPEG is still a thing. But at some point, you know, some of these file formats and data formats are just going to no longer be around. So this idea of archiving and preserving the data is a whole other, yeah, I don't want, it makes my head hurt.
Sorry to distract. Continue.
No, it's not a distraction. I mean, it's a really interesting, yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm just looking, yeah. The only thing that comes to mind is the comedian Stephen Wright saying, well, you can't have everything because where would you put it? Other thoughts on the version 2.0?
I've got another. This is Jim again. I was actually reluctant to make this comment without having an alternative to offer, but I'm noticing in the three themes, it's sort of one of these things is not like the other issue. So what I mean by that is biorisk and disinformation are intuitively problems. Like they can be construed as policy problems, but virtuality is not necessarily problematic, right? I think we're getting at problematic issues around virtuality, but I wonder if reframing virtuality to make it more consistent with conceptually biorisk as a problem, disinformation as a problem, might make it easier to digest.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's funny, if I look at this and I think which one of these is not like the other, for me, biorisk is kind of the outlier because disinformation and virtuality are so digital focused. Yeah, let me think about that. So my initial reaction is, yes, biorisk, set of problems we're trying to solve. Disinformation, yes, set of problems that we're trying to solve. And then virtuality is kind of like, well, there's a set of problems we're trying to solve, but actually this is our hope because this is the future we are embracing. So it's almost like that's the and I'm far from a technotopiast, but that's another way to think about it, is that is a future that we're not battling, or that's the future we're building. The other things I think are things that we're fighting. So that's actually an interesting reaction to it.
This point, I mean, I do think there's a way to frame the biorisk and disinformation categories as less about problems, but also about, what sometimes I've heard you refer to as like affordances or ways in which technology can enable, for instance, in the case of, biology, things like, precision medicine, digitized healthcare, Internet of Bodies technologies that allow improved health outcomes and these sort of transhuman possibilities that some people find very appealing. And similarly, in the sort of disinformation bucket, you could expand it so it's not just the problems of disinformation; it's the overall ecosystem of the information environment now, where disinformation is one of the most pronounced downsides. So that would be a way, and I missed the first 10 minutes, so I don't know if you talked about the the overall goals of framing this in terms of challenges, in which case, sure, it makes sense to again, focus on kind of, the policy problems. But maybe another, sense of challenge is just, these are things that have both good and bad. And part of the role of the TNL 2.0 is to sort of consider and explore both sides.
Yeah. So what I mentioned at the beginning was that version 1 of the lab was really our focal point were emerging technology areas, and that served a purpose because we do want to be working in emerging technologies, and at a policy shop that's usually not a main focus. So that brought the focus there, but then that also is somewhat devoid of context. So we brought the context in through the work, but part of the motivation for version 2.0 is to really be focused on the context and the problems we're trying to solve. But I like trying to make biorisk and disinformation more neutral, and it's almost like it's funny because the sub bubbles are somewhat more neutral. I guess the disinformation ones are less so, but genetic modification of humanity, that can have good and bad outcomes. Climate instability adaptation means that you are adapting, which is a thing. Yeah, the next pandemic is pretty focal. And then, mutually assured deception, to the extent that mutually assured destruction can be thought of in a positive light, which I think some people would argue that it is. Yeah, so maybe it's not disinformation. I have to think about what the language is that's appropriate for that change. The disinformation, in some ways, that was really driven by some particular funding opportunities that would resonate with them. But there are ways to change that narrative a bit, so it'll still work for that. Sonar.
Two quick things. I feel like the word where you've got mutually assured deception and counter fallacy prototyping, it seems like bias could be a good bridge between those two. That might be a little less that could be neutral. And the second thing was that, and this is my own personal bias, I'd love to see the word accountability in the center alongside equity and ethics. At least in the climate world, too much of what we do can't work without it. And it's kind of a central preoccupation we have with new systems that we're building, that I think does relate to everything else in the chart.
Got it. Let me think about that. And Padma, yes. So the reason that sustainability, equity, ethics, and narrative is in the center is that all of this work touches on that or includes that. I mean, we specifically didn't want to break out equity as a separate bullet because we think it's central to everything that we do. Other thoughts? Cool. Well, thanks for listening and thanks for the input. This has actually been very helpful, and everything's always a draft and no plan survives first contact. So I really like the idea of trying to find a little bit more neutral language for the three main grand challenges. And then the accountability piece is really, yeah, I agree with that. I just and this is just from a presentation standpoint, I always worry about the number of words on a slide or a screen. And I'll just show you this is the DoD approved version of this. So everything an acronym, and I especially liked how the climate instability and adaptation became CIA. So there may be some hidden meaning there.
I wanted to, say that, I generally think these three challenges are excellent, and there's just a lot of work happening across RAND. I'm sure you're tracking in all three of these areas, and only recently, just in the past month, I've been involved in various funded project work from the FFRDCs in basically all three of these. So in terms of an interface between what's happening in the TNL and sort of the big RAND and the traditional funders, I think these three categories just fit very well.
Yeah, and I think the goal is that the goal is that the lab would be able to do things that the traditional RAND projects wouldn't do. Take an approach that is a little wackier, or try some methods or techniques that wouldn't normally fall into sort of a typical project. So I think that's where Big RAND is going to find its most value in the stuff going on at the lab. And we've been having some conversations with NSRD folks, and I think there is an appetite for that, because there is a recognition that most of the project work at RAND is fairly constrained. Some of it has some open-ended where you can do some exploratory stuff, but it's usually the sponsor usually wants an answer. So yeah, and feasibility, I think, is a piece of sustainability. I think accountability is also maybe contained within sustainability. Each of these things, I mean, you've kind of seen, right? There were three grand challenge questions, and then each question popped out into three sort of sub questions, and then those sub questions could pop out into things. I think sustainability, equity, ethics, and narrative also need to be articulated as to what it is that we mean by that, because I think when you say sustainability, it means very different things to different people. And I don't know that most people would think that equity is a sustainability problem, but I would argue that it is. Ben, I'm actually curious your thoughts on whether that makes sense, that equity and ethics are actually sustainability, elements of sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, it's when I think of sustainability, I think of moving towards longer term thinking, and I think presumably that also requires more inclusive types of thinking, where sustainability doesn't just mean sustainable for the elite or for the few that can afford it, but presumably sustainable for a larger set of communities, including those that have historically been marginalized. So that's how I would make the link. I think, yeah, for sure, there can be a very good link made, and then of course there's even lots of economic and other arguments that just suggest that if you don't get equity right, it's gonna hurt the long-term economic prospects. It's gonna hurt other forms of development and innovation that will also be a drag on sustainability. So yeah, that's I mean, I certainly like the idea of making a connection there. Provides another hook to sort of anchor the importance of something like equity. And so very much would value that. But yeah, it would want to think a little bit more exactly how best to make the argument. But I think it would be something about like the idea of like long-term and more inclusive thinking as like a core component of sustainability that directly ties to equity.
Yeah, I think that's why we want to be very careful. I'm invoking my artist wife in my head about articulation and articulating what we think these terms actually mean. And because for me, if you have an unrepresented or repressed segment of the population, that isn't long-term sustainable. So I think, yeah, it is key that this is not, we're not talking about sustainability for meaning the status quo is sustained, but instead that without true equity, that really is, if you come up with a solution that you say is sustainable, but it has serious equity issues, then it really isn't sustainable. It's just sustainable for a subset of the population, and we can't really work that way. Good deal. Well, thanks everyone for being a part of it. And I will do some tweaks, and we'll start to roll some of this language out, and we'll be talking about this for some of the summer sprint stuff. So we'll be doing some stuff around water. The metaverse stuff is continuing. I think Ben is wrangling a grant proposal and is doing some other stuff in the EIEX. And so in the spirit of the way the lab works, the way that we're going to start doing all this stuff is just by starting to do it. So, and yeah, look forward to having everybody involved and getting your input. So have a great rest of the Friday and a great weekend.